Okay, I'm trying this one more time. I am here live, and it will be posted on my YouTube to talk about Chapter 9 of Mindsight, which is Making Sense of Our Lives, subtitle Attachment and the Storytelling Brain. This is a fantastic chapter. It is explaining some of the reasons that parenting is really, really important to me. It explains a lot of cool research that I have utilized in my own philosophies and my own life for a very long time. So if you are reading Mindsight along with us, do not skip Chapter 9. There are fantastic things in there. He briefly goes over the theory of attachment and the fact of how we analyze attachment types. And he starts off by introducing one of his patients, Rebecca, who is the child of an alcoholic parent and a bipolar parent. And there were 5 kids in the house. So there are a lot of traumatic issues that happened. She even talks about there were many times when they would sneak up to the attic and be reading books to each other by flashlight to kind of drown out what was happening in the rest of the house. And he talks about this as an example of, this is a person who came to him and basically, originally she said that, you know, my childhood doesn't really impact who I am or my life currently. However, as I said, I think it was in the last chapter, even if you don't know it, the events that have occurred do impact you in some way, shape, or form. And this is a perfect example of how that happens. So I am going to again reiterate that in previous chapters, and if you've listened to anything on my YouTube channel outside of book reviews, I've talked about this as well, that there is this concept of feeling felt by another individual, and this is so critical in the human brain that feeling felt by someone else has led researchers to look at how feeling felt as a child can change how you are as an adult. And basically, and I will talk more about this, they have used research and shown that if you are truly connected to someone and you have a secure attachment, what happens is not only do you feel felt at that time, but you grow into a person who has a fully developed prefrontal cortex and middle part of your prefrontal cortex. And you're able to do self-regulation, you are thoughtful, you are resourceful, and it sets you up to be kind of a productive person in life. So this entire theory, attachment theory, utilized a piece of research that was done called the Infant Strange experiments. And I'm pretty sure you could YouTube that. I can't remember if I watched it at some point when I was studying attachment theory, but I think you can. This basically takes a mother and an infant, and it puts them in a situation where you put them in a room with a whole bunch of toys and things for the infant, and I believe it's 12 months is the infant age. And the mother leaves for a period of time and then comes back, and observers were watching infant behavior specifically. In other research, they also talk about doing this experiment and adding in things like testing of the skin, and I'll talk about that when it comes up. I have lots of sporadic notes, so bear with me. In this research, the cool thing about this is there was the people who volunteered to be part of this experiment allowed researchers to observe them in the home beforehand and follow the kids after. So this experiment was ongoing, and there's like 20, at this point, I think 25 years of data based on what they were observing during this experiment, which for a biology geek like me is amazing. Like 25 years. That's incredible data. So we have learned many, many things. So I am going to introduce you, as Dan does, to the 4. They started with just 3 types of attachment. Later on, they added a 4th. So I'll just cover, like Dan does, all 4 of those attachment types. The first is secure attachment. Secure attachment, I think he said, is 2/3 of the children, which ends up like 66% of the children showed signs of secure attachment. Basically, secure attachment meant that for this experiment, when the mother left the room, the babies or infants showed some signs of distress. They cried, they were looking for their mom. Then, upon return, they greeted the mom in some way. Smiled, crawled to them, clapped, were happy, were being basically the mother returning brought them some bit of co-regulation and calm. And then when their mom came back, they were able to explore their environment, play with the toys, and interact in the environment they were. They characterized these infants as settling down easily. Even if it took a little while, they still were able to settle down and then go explore. In observations before this experiment, these were infants who were in households where the parents met their needs most of the time. So if the child was in distress, the mother was able to meet that distress, and so their basic needs were met. The second attachment is called avoidant attachment, and that attachment, he said, was about 1/5 of the infants, which is about 20% of the participants. And with an avoidant attachment infant, what they observed in the experiment was that they focused on the toys and the environment more than the mother. And they had no distress when the mother left. So you put them in this environment with the mom, they immediately start exploring. The mother gets up to leave. They don't show any signs of anything. They just keep playing. When the parent returns, they basically ignore the mom. Like, it doesn't matter. They're still playing. Sometimes they even avoided the mom when she returned. And basically, the observation was they were avoiding the emotional part of the environment. They interacted very well with toys. There was no, problem or issue, but there was not a lot of emotion from the infant during that experiment. The observations before the experiment, the home observations, concluded that these were infants whose mom was not always responding in a reliable way. So sometimes she may have met the needs, sometimes not so much, basically becomes not reliable in the infant's eyes, I guess, or brain, really. And when that happens, oftentimes researchers were saying that basically the infant's mind is saying, my mom doesn't really meet my needs, so it really doesn't matter whether she's there or not. These infants are very capable infants. These infants literally, are not showing distress in any ways. There's just not emotional upheaval at all. So they are very capable. They're playing. They're interacting with things in the environment. The third type that was original to the research was called ambivalent attachment. Ambivalent attachment occurred in 14% of the infants that were studied. And this infant showed signs of being very wary or anxious even before the mother left. So, like, they came, they sat down, instead of interacting with the environment or interacting with the mom, they were just like, what's happening, what's happening, what's happening. Then when the parent returned, they would seek the parent at first, like crawl up to the parent or want the parent, try and get the parent's attention. However, they were not soothed by the parent. So this is a kind of phenomenon, and they called these like the infant would cry or cling to the parent, but there was no ability for the parent to readily soothe the child. So there wasn't a like time where, I missed you too, I love you too, blah, blah, blah. Then they would go play. They were in this kind of heightened emotional state. And what researchers observed in the homes before this was that there was inconsistent care. Sometimes very able to meet everybody's needs, sometimes not so much. There was like this back and forth. It was very inconsistent. And so that was the resulting behavior that you saw. The fourth category, and this was, I'm not sure how long, I don't think even Dan, I'm trying to remember, says when they added this fourth category, but they said of all of the attachment, of those three attachment types, there is 10% of those that are categorized now as disorganized attachment. And disorganized attachment is kind of not the greatest attachment. When you look at the infant strange situation, these are the infant that basically is in a really high emotionally upset state. They could even be described as terrified. When the parent returns, they will approach the parent, but then they would withdraw from the parent really quick, or they freeze. Like, they see the parent, they start going to the parent, and then they stop, or they fall where they are and don't want to continue going on. They have this almost, and why they call it disorganized is it's almost an opposite thing occurring at the same time. So they could be clingy and crying, but also like grab them and then like be crying. The parent tries to hold them and then they pull away while they're crying. Like they don't even want to be soothed by the parent. And this type of attachment is specific to those who often have a frightening or traumatic time in the home. Sometimes it can be, it's usually not a single event, to be honest, at least how Dan describes it, and I haven't read all about it. But based on this chapter, Dan describes it as having several traumatic events or a parent that would be frightening, and so it results in this type of attachment. Now, this I knew about that before and talked about the importance of attachment theory and how you are with as far as consistency with your kids. Side note, Dan does not talk about this, but as my personal note, this is why I have talked about why it's really hard to get into conversations with people about things like cry it out, because for me, when I talk about meeting a child's needs, cry it out is the perfect example of kind of how a parent would not meet a child's needs and what the response would be. So if a child is crying for whatever reason and you're not picking them up because you think it's bedtime, let's say, and they need to learn to sleep, that whole idea of teaching them to self-soothe was the original idea, that they don't need a parent to always soothe. But the fact is, our human brain actually depends on having a secure relationship with a caregiver to soothe, to co-regulate. So when you don't do that for a period of time, you actually will train the baby to know that you are not going to respond to their needs. And so you will have less crying most of the time if you do it long enough. And this is interesting too, because this is also when tolerances and genetics come into play. Like, the baby's own disposition will determine whether they learn that very quickly or whether they don't, whether they're very persistent. And that doesn't have to do with the current attachment to the parent. That has to do with their own personality. So I bring that up because he doesn't talk a lot about, until the end of this chapter, about genetics. But I do think it's important that we're not laying this groundwork of attachment theory saying that all screwed up people had terrible parents who messed up when they were a child. I don't think that that's true. There are certain personality and certain things that happen to people that make them less able to cope and less able to deal with things. Not necessarily all attachment theory, but it's a huge piece of the puzzle. So for me, this was a parental philosophy that really resonated with me because it allowed me to look at how I was treating my kids and raising my babies and have influence on how they grow into, or at least have a foundation to be, a secure adult. All right. So here we go. How does the attachment theory and those attachment levels of attachment affect integration of brain and body? Because that's Dan's thing. So if you had a secure attachment, then the studies showed that you have good flow of energy and information. So no big shocker there. It just, would be what we call a base flow. If you had avoidant attachment, and this was not a parent that's not responding to needs in a reliable manner, they tend towards rigidity. So if we've talked about the brain and how you have, on one side you have rigidity, on the other side you have chaos, the infants who have avoidant attachment as they grow up tend to have their information and energy kind of skewed towards rigidity. Ambivalent attachment results in a tendency towards chaos. Super interesting. And then for disorganized attachment, you basically bounce in between rigidity and chaos. You go back and forth. And this type moves beyond the window of tolerance. In other words, it is going to highly affect a person's ability to cope with things. So what he's saying there, I think, is that if you had an avoidant attachment or an ambivalent attachment, although you might have a tendency towards rigidity or chaos, it's not affecting your window of tolerance. In other words, you can still function in a relatively big box of tolerance and not collapse into the results of feeling triggered all the time. All right. And as I said, they did do this research for 25 years. 25 years later, they look at these individuals, and here's their observations. It's so cool. I really think this is so cool. My geeky side loves this. For securely attached infants, they found 25 years later they were meeting their potential. They had good relationships with others. They were respected by peers. They could regulate their emotions well. In other words, all signs pointed to their middle prefrontal cortex developing the right rate. They developed good bodily regulation. They had good attunement towards others. They had emotional balance. They had responses that were flexible. They could employ some fear modulation. They could show empathy and insight, and they had moral awareness. So basically, this would be a good indicator that early secure attachment is good for the developing brain, and it puts them in a good foundation to reach their potential, right, as far as they could. I, again, want to caveat there and say it is not the only factor that determines all those things. However, it was a good foundational one, and it was obviously correlated in the study. Okay, avoidant. The adults who they looked at who had avoidant attachment, they did find out that they were restricted emotionally, and peers often said they were aloof, controlling, or unlikable. And in the ambivalent attachment, they had a tendency to have a lot of anxiety and insecurities present as an adult. For disorganized attachment, they had almost an impairment in the ability to relate to others. They had a really hard time regulating emotions. In fact, in this group of adults, they found that there was a tendency towards dissociation and an increased tendency to have PTSD if they had any trauma. It's intriguing. I think basically Dan is saying it really matters what, in fact, hold on. I just looked at my notes and I actually wrote down, Dan said in that chapter, what parents do matters enormously, right? It matters. It matters what they do. And also, he quoted a scientist who was at a conference and said that attachment patterns are one of the very few dimensions of human life that appear to be largely independent of genetic influence. In other words, the treatment of babies in that first year, and I think there's some argument on how long after as well. So the treatment of babies and toddlers and children can influence beyond genetics. So whether you have fantastic genes or terrible genes, the attachment really does make a difference. Mind blown. Please, please, please. And that's a shout out to all of you who open your home to foster kids because you can make a difference there. That's a shout out to all of the step parents and all of the people who work through their own stuff and try so hard to provide amazing experiences for their children and or other children. Okay. Now comes the really interesting part. How we parent depends on not how we were parented, but how we make sense of how we were treated. Here's the interesting part. So, in other words, I've just said it's really important what parents do, but what happens if your parent wasn't super responsive? Does that mean you're going to be a terrible parent? No, because you can break that cycle in your own life. And caveat here, this is why I'm a coach, because I love to make sure that people are making sense of their past, that they're able to process through things, that they're able to flourish into their best self by supporting themselves and making sense of their past and present. I mean, that is the ultimate goal. So what does he mean by making sense? He's going to go back and talk about this self-narrative. And remember, I'm not sure if I talk about this later. Hold on, I don't want to jump too far ahead. That comes in a little bit. basically that narrative of if I said, tell me about your childhood, that narrative that you have, that autobiographical remembrance of your life, if it is a coherent account, right, of the past, you can make sense of the things that happened. Does not mean that the things that happened were fantastic all the time. It simply means that cognitively and emotionally, you have processed through to understand that narrative, and it doesn't get jumbled or mixed up with feelings. And I will give examples of how that tends to be. How do you determine somebody's narrative? Well, there's a great tool. And this is a warning to all of my clients. After reading this chapter, I'm so intrigued by it that I would love for my clients to let me experiment on them? No. To let me go through this tool that Dan uses and others use. And it is called the AAI, Adult Attachment Interview. And this is an evaluation. It is basically a bunch of questions. The key to this is that it is done with someone that is trusted and that it's recorded. And the reason, I guess it doesn't have to be recorded if you had somebody else there evaluating it while you were doing it. But most of the time it's done by one individual in which you record it, because it's not just the answers to the questions, it's how that comes about. It's how they answer the question, not just what they say to answer the question, if that makes sense. And this evaluation will look at the history of attachment. It'll look at how the person currently thinks about that history in relationship to themselves and to their family. Super interesting. And there are some really cool things about this evaluation. It's a whole bunch of questions. It's basically talking about, tell me about your childhood, and a couple of other really specific questions. The interesting part of this evaluation is Dan makes a point to say that when this was developed, it was developed with the idea that memory is fallible. What intrigues me in the neuroscience of this is I am fascinated personally about the Innocence Project and confession tapes when there's forced confessions, and also true crime when you're relying on witnesses only, especially if the crime happened in the past. And the reason I'm obsessed, I think, is because I have studied enough to realize that the brain is incredible and memory is fallible. And here's the reason that he gives. He said, even if you are in a complete mindset and place of honesty, where you're speaking honestly, there's no fear, there's no, it's not a confession, even if you're at the best possible circumstances, your mind tells you to say things that others want to hear. I mean, when I'm talking about confessions, just listen to that. The brain says things or tells you to say things that it thinks others want to hear. Not that are actually true, but that they want to hear. So if someone is asking you the same question over and over and you're giving an answer and they don't want to hear that, they want to hear the opposite, it almost is just a matter of time before your mind says, well, just say the thing that they want to hear. It's fascinating. Also, the brain also has you say things that you want to appear like. In other words, you're going to say things in a manner that shines you in a light or presents yourself in a way that you think you want to be seen. You're not going to say, I was an idiot and flew into a rage and wrecked the car, right? You're going to say things about, oh, well, I tried to stop an accident from happening because so-and-so was upset and yelling, right? Because you are painting a picture of yourself. It's fascinating neuroscience there. So when they do this evaluation, basically they're not looking at accuracy of facts, but the coherency of the story, and they look at that and are able to determine your own attachment, which I think is fascinating. It's like backwards planning. I promise I don't have pages and pages of notes. Okay, I do have pages and pages of notes, but it will go fast. Okay, so here's how it works. Based on the narrative that the adult gives, you can also determine the child's attachment to them, right? So remember I said your attachment does not determine how you parent, but it does determine, but your narrative, how you made sense of it, does determine how your child might attach to you. So if you have a secure, coherent narrative, you tend to have children with secure attachments. If you have a dismissive narrative, that tends to lead to avoidant attachments. If you have a preoccupied narrative, that tends to lead to ambivalent attachment. And if you have unresolved narrative, that tends to lead to disorganized attachment. It is fascinating to look at the connection between all of these and the importance of recognizing where we are and processing through things. Because here's the really cool part about all of this. You can, at any time, reverse where you are by using the tools, mindfulness, and integration. So it's really important that you realize even if you or your child had a traumatic experience in their childhood and their attachment but might not be a secure attachment, the great thing about it is you can change this, because you can change the narrative through earned secure life narrative. I love when they throw those technical terms. And basically, an earned secure life narrative happens through being felt and seen by somebody else who we trust. This is key. So when we talk about attachment, we normally throw that on the parents and we say primary caregiver's attachment. However, if there's not a secure attachment, they can attach to other people that are trusted in their lives that allow them to feel seen. It could be a grandma, an aunt, a godparent, a foster parent. It could be a teacher. It could be a friend. And in our adult life, we can also do that. We can also finally find someone who really sees us and makes us feel felt and process through these things and find healing and integration and change everything for future generations. I love this chapter because it's full of cool stuff and hope. So, I'm back to my notes. So let me see where I'm at. Okay, so now he's going into some people that we are familiar with. So if you recall a few chapters back, we talked about the guy who was stuck in his left side of his brain, who's very factual, and he kind of cut off the right side of his brain, which was the creative and autobiographical part, right? When, these are the type of people who say things like, well, my family had no impact on my life, But he also said when he was asked questions from the AAI, he said, my family didn't really have an impact, but I can't really recall any memories from them. And so Dan makes a point to say, so if you can't recall any memories, then how do you know they didn't have an impact? Oh, it's very interesting. Basically, there is a lot of dismissing here, right? When you have a dismissive narrative, which I just listed, right? Basically, when you take the AAI, a dismissive narrative is one that has really brief responses that reiterates that relationships didn't really have an impact, and it lacks a lot of details out of the biography, right? And he's saying, Dan says that people who have a dismissive narrative tend to be dominant in left brain thinking because they shut down the emotional part and they shut down that part of the cortex, but the lower limbic still feels it, and the coherent story has to come about after you go through processing, healing, and integration. So we already did that with that patient, and you can see that he was able to process through, and he did a lot of journaling, and he was able to kind of rewrite his narrative, especially in his present. So although he can't change how he was attached as a child, right, he can absolutely work through those problems and find secure attachment. This, we really saw it with his wife, the secure attachment that he felt seen and heard, that he wanted to heal because of her, and that he even worked through his kind of issues with being touched and things of that nature for her and with her, and he rewrote that whole narrative. And his current narrative is coherent. His current narrative has integration between left and right brain. There is not dismissiveness in his new narrative. So if you talk about his life, he is able to do that. And he's even able to bring that, some of that clarity to the past and definitely to the present, which is, I told you back then, I thought it was beautiful. All right. The preoccupied narrative. So, this one is interesting. So if someone has a preoccupied narrative, oftentimes they recall memories from the past, but then they jump to the future because the memories from the past trigger feelings that haven't been dealt with, and so it triggers them to think about things that are currently going on. And basically, the past is intruding on the present, right? So the example was there was a gentleman who was talking about his past, and he was saying, my relationship with my dad was okay, but then I really wasn't close, and and then my mom, she was okay, but I think she liked my brother better. Oh my gosh. And last week when she came to visit, she skipped my house, which was right by the airport, and went directly to his house. So just the bringing up of the past memories was triggering him in the present because he had feelings that were not dealt with. Basically, this is ambivalent attachment because he cannot see himself in his own eyes. So when he's telling that narrative is not about himself, right? That narrative is about how, like, how it relates back to him, right? Like how his mom feels about him. It's not about himself or who he is or how he came to be who he is. It's about how others still see him or still feel about him. And infants with ambivalent attachment do not have a solid sense of themselves, right? Because they were never seen or felt, right? They never felt. And so they're not really sure who they are. And Dan says the central theme for this type would be that I need others, but I can't depend on others. And he brings forth the example of this person is in a relationship, however, is having a really difficult time in the relationship. Like he said, I love my girlfriend, however, if my girlfriend comes home late from work and doesn't call and tell me that she's going to be late or why, I can't handle it. Like, I think of all these terrible things and how she doesn't respect me and she doesn't love me and all of these things. And here is key of emotional entanglement. So, in other words, I'm linked to this person I love, just like I was linked to my caregiver, except I'm not differentiated. So these, if you're not familiar, have to go back to some of the early chapters where we talked about all of these concepts. If you're not differentiated healthily from your caregiver, you can take on their fear and anxieties. And what happens is children who do that end up as adults who all also feel anxious, and instead of feeling like I'm separate from this individual and this individual is separate from me, it gets entangled in their emotions and in their mind. So if you think about it, a healthy, securely attached person, when a partner comes home late from work, would think, oh, there could have been a million things that made them late for work, right? Or late from work. Oh, they had an extra project, or traffic was really bad, or they forgot something and had to go back. This person doesn't think that way. It's all, are they mad at me and they don't love me and they're cheating on me and they're doing all these things and they must not love me and they must. So it's all about them, right? It's an entanglement that's not healthy. So understanding the origins of the insecurity means that we can then use these tools again, mindsight, mindfulness, and integration, to integrate the brain. I'm just making sure I'm not missing anything. So we can go from the hyperarousal of attachment, right, where there's loss or uncertainty, which leads to chaos. We can use the wheel of awareness, which Dan has introduced and you can see on his website, and that pattern of finding a safe place to self-soothe ourselves. And doing that, we can really achieve vertical integration again, which means we're staying, in his example of the wheel of awareness, we're staying in the hub. So for me, that's we're staying grounded. We recognize that these feelings are coming up because, again, we don't stop feelings from happening. We are aware that they're happening and we are mindful of them happening. And we learn to let them come and let them go and not react out of them. So Dan, again, would say that not only do you let them come up, but you name them, because you need to name them to tame them. So, oh, fear, I see you. Oh, insecurity, I see you. And you use your, tools to work through them. All right. If you have these issues that are unresolved, if past trauma is not resolved, you end up with preoccupied and distant. So this is the unresolved narrative, right? Which is disorganized attachment, which is kind of this, I consider one of the scariest attachments. So if the past trauma, which literally comes out in your narrative as way disorganization, certain times in the story are like barely even coherent to follow, you end up terrified because there's no like connection or understanding of anything that's happened. This is really interesting because I feel like this one insight for me leads to so many other things. When you have this unresolved narrative, oftentimes you have failed to, and I think we talked about this last chapter, if not the chapter before, both of which are good, to put your memory from an implicit memory into an explicit memory. So remember, explicit memories are the memories we remember and we can put in our timeline very well. Implicit memories are things that we're reacting to and it's almost like an unconscious reaction. These are times that we can react to environmental triggers, we can react to auditory triggers, we can react to emotional triggers. All of these things, right, can happen if our memories are implicit. Oftentimes we deal with implicit memories when we're dealing with childhood. And this idea of having a narrative that has chaos in it that was never resolved means that we've kind of enveloped it as an implicit memory, but we either intentionally at the time or unintentionally, I mean, it depends on how deep the trauma was, chose not to make it an explicit memory. A lot of times this is really scary stuff and really traumatic stuff. However, I want to tell you what happens if this happens. If our brain has chosen to make it an implicit memory instead of an explicit memory, it's done that for some reason to protect us. What that basically means is the FFF amygdala hijack that I talk about all the time, that freeze, flee, or fight response becomes embodied. It's an embodied response, right? And we've seen how some people cut off all emotions through and want to avoid trauma, and that gets buried deep in the body and they become unaware because they don't want to tap into it, they don't want to recognize it, they don't want to deal with it, right? So the problem is when this occurs and it becomes an embodied response to an implicit trigger that we don't know about, this trigger happens and we release that response, that heightened amygdala response. And Dan says this makes sense because, right, the brain association here is the things that fire together, wire together, right? So the trigger and the response fired together originally, and so they're wired together, but then we cut them off and put them implicitly buried into ourselves, and then it comes up and we're like, what the hey happened? Well, this is what happened. Basically, you had fear or something super traumatic occur, there was no resolution, no solution in your brain, and you ended up with disorganized attachment, which again has these huge emotional regulation issues. When you examine memories for connection, a lot of times you will find that people with this have feelings of feeling out of control or feeling betrayal. And what's really interesting is that his example of this was a parent who was feeling very triggered by their 2-year-old son. And I'm going to applaud this person because they went to therapy because they were afraid of themselves. They realized this was an issue not of their child because the other parent could deal with the child, but they were dealing with their own response. And they said, well, I feel out of control, like literally he'll do something, it will trigger me, and I feel like I'm going to lose it. I do not know why. So, how does he deal with this? Okay, this is, again, a great example of how you cannot avoid your past. that it comes, even if you buried it deep and cut yourself off, it's going to come up again. So you can use journaling, which will decrease the physiological reactivity that you have and increase your sense of well-being. This is really interesting because I'm a person who I would say I avoid journaling, which is interesting. Like, it's almost like when I read this, I'm like, oh man, maybe I know that it's going to bring up stuff and I don't want to journal about it. But when people say journal, I'm like, I don't want to journal. The thing is with journaling, it is such a good practice for your brain that it actually doesn't matter if you ever read it out loud. It doesn't matter if anyone else ever reads it. Just the act of journaling has been shown through research to do those things. It increases your sense of well-being. I'm not sure the reasons why. I'm sure there are many. It also decreases your physiological reactivity because you're getting this out. It's not being embodied and stuck inside. So it is a venue that is very healthy. I think this is also really healthy to teach kids. I think this is why there has been a huge increase in social emotional learning to get kids to journal and to get things out. They never have to share it. We don't make kids share, but just the fact that they do that can be a huge, immense tool for them. If they can do this, and they can release and heal, you, again, stop the future generations. So for this parent who came to him, she was able to stop reacting in a way that would have caused trauma to her kid, which is a huge deal. So he ends this chapter with some beautiful words. He talks about healing the mind leads to compassion, not only for ourselves, but for others. And then he talks about love, and I wrote this down. He said, love is when you have openness, curiosity, and acceptance in the mind of another. And that type of love, where there's openness, curiosity, and acceptance, is really what secure attachment is all about. And secure attachment leads to self-compassion and self-acceptance. So, love, right? My hippie self is like, oh, love. When we feel we are in the heart of another, we can basically lead to a healthy brain and love for ourselves. And we can learn to integrate those old narratives to stop any of the past cycles so that we can change future generations. And this, again, is a shout out to all of those who are befriending and really seeing, especially children, making them feel felt, making them feel heard, making them feel seen, because I think that is way more important than our society knows. I think we have a tendency to not do that. In fact, there used to be, you're all going to kill me because I don't know where that quote comes from, but children should be seen and not heard. When we say things like that, when we dismiss children's opinions and feelings and even dismiss them as people, I think we're doing a real disservice to all of society. I think the future generations can be truly improved when we take a step back and look at what's really important. And what's really important is making sure each and every one of us can be seen and felt inside someone else and mirrored back. All right, that's the end of that chapter. I will put this up on YouTube, so check out my YouTube channel, Best Self, Best Health. You can find the other chapters there. We only have a few more chapters, so if you want to jump on the Mind Site bandwagon, do so. And if you can also find my other books there, and my next book will be coming soon. So I hope you guys have a fantastic week and are not sweating your brains out. It's definitely hot here. So I will see you next week.